Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I'm an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos here on my YouTube channel, Watch Barbara Knit. Make sure to check in the description below where you will find all of my social media outlets, including how to join our Watch Barbara Knit Facebook group, where to find my patterns where you can get them and knit them up for yourself, and how to support me on Patreon. Today, I decided to talk about yarn. I know that's a huge surprise. Yarn? Why would you talk about yarn? I'm obsessed with yarn, obviously. And specifically, I wanted to talk about superwash versus non-superwash wools. What is the difference and what you need to know about how they behave differently and what different things you might want to use them for. So, wool. It comes from sheep. All different kinds of sheep and different kinds of sheep give different kind of wool. A spinner, you know what? I should probably have a spinner on and interview them so they can talk to me more in depth. My experience is with using yarn that somebody else has made. And I know that spinners have a much more in-depth knowledge of fibers and how they behave. If you would like to hear me talk to a spinner about yarn and learn with me, let me know. And if there's anyone you could suggest, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. But wool comes from different kinds of sheep. Some of them have longer fibers, some of them have shorter fibers, some of them have curlier fibers, some of them have straighter fibers, some of them are, I think, crimpy is what they call it, and it like gets together. They talk about micron count, which is how thick the cross section of the fiber is, and the finer that is, the softer it is, etc., etc., etc. But one thing that I think all wool has in common is the way that the hair itself is structured. So if you picture the filament that is hair, the wool, because it's the hair of the sheep, it's not smooth. It has little tiny, tiny, tiny scales on it. Now, these scales are part of why wool traps warmth, because there's little tiny air pockets. And it's also why wool can be scratchy. The coarser it is and the more coarser the scales are, you're going to feel that on your skin. But it also really helps the memory of wool, of the yarn, because what it is every single little filament has these little scales on it and they all go in one direction, like on a shark. I don't know if you've ever been to an aquarium and they let you pet the sharks and you've pet them one way and they're smooth, and if you try to go against the grain, it's going to cut your hand up. And that's the way wool is. If you go against the grain, those little edges of those little scales kind of pop up and catch. So if you have two strands of wool rubbing against each other, those little scales catch and they prevent them from sliding back and forth. So it stays in its shape, and it's one of the reasons why wool has very good memory. And what memory means is when you put the yarn and you set the stitch size and you put it where you want it, it remembers where you want it and it stays there because you've set it there. You block it and everything, but it pulls back into that shape, which is why wool sweaters, even large ones, keep their shape fairly well because they have that memory, as opposed to like a cotton, which is going to grow. So, but those little scales, if they rub against each other a lot, on a garment where you would see something like this is like under the armpit, or if you're constantly wearing a purse that rubs on your shoulder, if you put it in the washing machine, as it rubs against each other, if it rubs and rubs and rubs, those little scales start to fray. And they start to flare out more. And eventually, at some point, they quit rubbing and sliding and just go boink, and it's stuck. And when that happens, you have felt. You have felted your wool. All of those little scales have flipped up and locked together, and they're not going to go anywhere. And there's no way to unfelt. It's done. When it's done, it's done. Now, the softer your yarn, the more likely it is, the more easy it is to felt. That is why your softer wools felt more easily than your coarser wools. But that's the thing. And again, something I'd like to talk to a spinner about to understand better. When you introduce water to the party, it makes that felting process speed up. When you introduce heat to the party, it makes that felting process start up. So that is why if you have 100% wool, you don't put it in the washing machine, because the agitation combined with heat or not, or just even if it's on cold, combined with those fibers rubbing against each other, you end up felting your wool, which is why it needs to be hand washed, gently, lay flat to dry, cool water. Don't use hot water, makes it shrink more. Because what happens is when it locks together, it goes from smooth like this to ka-chunk, ka-chunk, and you got a little bitty nubby thing, and it all felts down. That said, there are wonderful things about wool. That grabbiness works amazingly in certain applications when you are doing color work. The fact that it locks together and it kind of blooms out and it gives you this beautiful field of intricate color work. I'm not saying anything negative about natural wool. I'm just explaining to you what happens. And the reason why I'm explaining this process to you is so that we can contrast it with superwash wool. Now, what has happened with superwash wool is the manufacturer of the yarn has taken a process that either removes or smooths out those scales. So all those little scales have been smoothed out so that they can rub against each other all day long and not really get felt. They don't get jammed up. They don't turn into felt. Now, the processes used in creating superwash can be very harsh. I believe chlorine is involved sometimes. It's chemicals. There are chemical processes used to make the superwash, and it just removes the scales. And then there are other processes that they actually lay down almost a synthetic to smooth out, to encase the scales. And that is your more typical superwash, and the wastewater produced when superwash is being created is not allowed legally to be put into general wastewater facilities. It has to go to a specialized treatment, which is why most superwash wools that use those types of chemical treatments are done in countries that have more lenient environmental laws, like China. But in response to this, the understanding that the wastewater is not the greatest thing in the world, there are more environmental processes. You can find eco-processed superwashes and things like that. So if that's something that concerns you and you want to use superwash wool, I would encourage you to do research into the specific superwash wool you're looking at and see how those processes work with that specific wool. I'm not trying to demonize superwash at all. Everybody has varying opinions about this, but I just wanted to give you the information and encourage you to seek out the information more if it's something that is important to you. But so through a process, some are more harsh, and others, they go towards their eco-processing techniques. They smooth those scales down. And those scales, then you can put them in the washing machine, and they're not going to lock in, and they're not going to felt for you. So if you want something felted, don't use superwash. So, I mean, it depends on your desired outcome. Neither one's good or bad as far as the yarn goes. It's what you want it to do. That said, you need to know other things about superwash. As I said, those scales on the non-superwash wools hold the shape. And it has memory and it keeps the shape of your fabric. When you remove those scales, you significantly hamper the yarn's ability to have that memory and to retain its shape. So that is why superwash yarns are frequently knit at a denser gauge than a non-superwash yarn, because if you knit it at a looser gauge, it tends to grow. And it can grow a lot once you've blocked it. So one of the big reasons I wanted to explain this to y'all, or at least use it as a teachable moment, is that it is super duper important if you are using a superwash yarn in a fitted item, like a garment, a hat, things like that, that you have to make your gauge swatch and you have to block your gauge swatch, because superwash yarns will grow. And they will grow significantly. If you are using a superwash yarn and it looks great on the needles as you're making it, and it fits perfect on the needles when you try it on, it is not going to fit after you've blocked it. It's going to grow. So when you're looking at a pattern, look at what yarn it was designed in, because the designer should know these things about the behavior of non-superwash versus superwash wool. And if the designer has designed the pattern for a non-superwash wool and you want to substitute a superwash wool, gauge, knitting your gauge and getting gauge becomes that much more important for you to see. And you might have to knit it at a slightly denser gauge than what the pattern calls for. This has been the subject, I think, of many tears when people make a sweater and they think it's perfect, but they didn't really do their gauge swatch, or they didn't block their gauge swatch, and they're like, why has my garment gotten so large? More likely than not, it's because it's superwash wool. And more likely than not, it's because the pattern was designed to use non-superwash wool. So if you're substituting a superwash into a pattern that was designed for non-superwash, be careful. Check your gauge very carefully and make sure that, do a big swatch. Make sure that it's going to work for you, because you really don't want to be frogging that much or have a giant sweater. So that is a superwash thing. Now, it sounds like I'm kind of down on superwash, which I'm not, because you really need a lot of the time that easy care. It can be very important depending on the context, especially if you're knitting for kids or someone who isn't going to be able to care for it with a delicate, tender, loving care. A lot of the indie dyed yarns you're going to see are superwash. And that is because superwash yarn, because of the processes that make it superwash, also make the fibers drink color. You can get a much, much more vibrant dye saturation on a superwash yarn than you can on a non-superwash yarn. So that's why you see a lot of superwash in these beautifully, brilliantly dyed yarns, because it's just the nature of the beast. I'm not saying you can't get beautiful regular wool, because you absolutely can. And amazing dyers do amazing things with straight up wool. But it's just superwash has an affinity for absorbing brighter colors in the dyeing process. So you'll see a lot of that. But also it depends on what you're making, because the same properties, the same lack of memory that will cause your sweater to grow leads to beautiful drape. So it's amazing for things like shawls or ponchos that don't necessarily have to be fitted, but you want to hang beautifully. So again, it depends on what you're wanting to do, and understanding this is how the wool is going to behave, and this is how superwash is going to affect the behavior, makes you able to make an educated choice as to which yarn you want to use for your project so you can have a successful project. Now, I am sure that there are many, many, many more details involved in the differences between the two, but I just wanted to give you a general overview so that to help you make better choices when you are trying to decide what yarn you want to use with what project. And this is solely talking about superwash versus superwash wool versus non-superwash wool. And all fibers have these complexities, and they all have their pluses and minuses. And I find it absolutely fascinating, and I hope y'all do too. Again, if you know of any spinners or someone I can talk to, or hey, if you're a spinner and you want to talk to me and you want to get on Zoom or something and we can see if we can record it, I'm always up for learning more, and especially, if I'm wrong about something or if I don't quite have a full understanding of something, I can always learn more. So this is a little bit of an answer for if you've been wondering what is the difference between regular and superwash wool. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, click that like button, and if you would like to be notified whenever I upload a new video, please subscribe to my channel and select notifications. Thank you so much.